Hello, everyone. So we're live. Welcome to the show. Today we're going to talk about Robinson Crusoe, a very famous piece of English literature. On this channel, I'm doing a book club, and we're going through the classics, and we're gonna read all the classics, and we're going to talk about them because um, if we want to save our country, then we have to read the classics. Because the reason that we're being destroyed is because we've forgotten our history and we've forgotten who we are and we've forgotten where we came from. So slowly, we're going to read all the classics. We're going to go through it, and we just randomly decided to do Robinson Crusoe. So I've got a very special guest on the show today, man from Twitter. His name is Frederick Tarr. Welcome to the show, Frederick.
Hello, I'm glad to be on here.
Right. So I'm just filling around. Trying to get this onto Twitter, share the video on Twitter. Do you want to tell us what you think about Robinson Crusoe while I'm doing that?
Yeah, so basically, well, everyone should know it's a novel about the castaway. In my opinion, the first castaway was probably Odysseus from the Odyssey, but this piece of literature doesn't contain any classical references at all. And that's probably because the author, Daniel Defoe, he had a dissenter education because he was a staunch Protestant. And
Right.
those types of people, they didn't have, at this particular time period, he would have been educated in things like astronomy and geography. So that's why it doesn't have any classical references, although you could have included plenty, really. If we, I'm basically the way that I think compare every novel is basically to the classics from Greek mythology, because that's just a sort of intellectual shorthand. So I could just start by outlining the plot if you want me to, or we could go into something else.
Right. Yeah. So the audience knows what's going on. Robinson Crusoe is a book written 1719 by a guy called Daniel Defoe. Essentially, the story is there's a bloke. The story starts. The story starts in a very interesting way because he's a young man. He wants to go on an adventure. He's feeling the spirit of adventure within him. He wants to go out and see the world. And his father basically says to him, no, don't do it. Don't do it. Just take the middle path. Take the easy path. You can live here in England. You can have a job. You can have a wife. You can be wealthy. You can be happy. Everything's set up for you. Don't go to sea. But he's like, no, sorry. He goes to sea anyway. Ends up getting in a shipwreck. No, ends up getting captured by pirates. Gets turned into a slave in Morocco or somewhere like that, some Muslim country. Manages to escape. Gets picked up by some Portuguese. Ends up in Brazil. Builds an estate for himself. Starts to grow food, and he becomes wealthy. But he still has this desire to go on an adventure. So he goes back out to sea and ends up getting shipwrecked in the Caribbean, totally by himself on an island for about 24 years. And during the course of this time, I mean, this part of the book was really difficult for me because I just thought it was kind of just a little bit boring, because it's a lot of like survivalist descriptions of him growing food and building his little home and doing this, that, and the other. But eventually he notices that there are, I'm not exactly sure if they're Africans. I'm not exactly sure what they are. He just calls them savages. But there are some savages coming over to the island where he's staying.
There'll be indigenous Americans, I think.
Yeah, to cannibalize people. And so he's a bit worried about that. In the end, he rescues one of them, names them Friday, and he starts to teach him about Christianity and this, that, and the other. And then eventually they also end up rescuing a Spanish guy and Friday's father as well, who they're also going to be cannibalized. And they hear this whole story. There's some Spanish shipwreck nearby. They develop a whole plan. They're going to team up with the Spanish and escape. But while they're waiting for the Spanish to come, an English ship arrives, and it's a ship that's going through a mutiny. And so he teams up with the captain. They kill the bad guys, take over the ship, go back to England, basically. And that's the story in a summary, just so people understand the plot. But yeah, so it's essentially, I guess it's a travel novel, I suppose. It's a survivalist novel. It's sort of a coming of
Slightly
age,
a religious novel.
slightly a religious novel, because there's a strong theme of redemption. Because he prays, actually, when he leaves England for the first time, he prays, because he hits a storm and they nearly drown, and he's very afraid. And he says, "Oh, if you get me out of this, I'll go home." But he doesn't go home. He just keeps going. So it's sort of like a coming of age, because he's rebelling against his father by going out on this adventure, and a mix of all kinds of things. I enjoyed it in the end, and I'm glad I read it. I must admit, I mean, it's not even a very long book, but I must admit, like halfway through, when we're going through like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 pages of him, capturing goats and raising them and this kind of thing, it was just like, oh my God.
Yeah, it
kind
wasn't
of surprising.
life-changing for me, but I'm still glad I read it, and I now have a basic knowledge of what it is, basically. The survivalist part, which takes up, I don't know, maybe half of the book, actually, is it's of particular interest to me, because I think that's a very natural way to live, or at least I wouldn't go as extreme as creating everything yourself out of the land and everything. But I think it's good to have a couple of your own chickens and that sort of thing. That's a good goal to aspire to, especially in modern circumstances of economic uncertainty. But yeah, some people go too far with that, in my opinion.
Well, it was just, it was kind of interesting. It was just kind of a struggle to read. I mean, it's interesting to me that the book was so popular, because this is a really, really famous, popular book. And yet, for a modern audience, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how many. Well, I found it a little bit boring, the survival part anyway. But it's, for a modern audience, I mean, a lot of people would probably find that quite dull to list, to read about him building his house and all that. But I suppose for the people of that time who lived closer to nature, they didn't have any electricity, and they were closer to the land, and so on and so forth. I guess perhaps maybe it resonated with them more. Maybe they saw it as kind of like a manual, or maybe I guess they just took interest in it more, I suppose.
Yeah, it is so detailed. I would be interested if you could use it as a manual for survival. How accurate would it be? I don't think it would be fully accurate. I have no idea though if you'd actually be able to survive.
It just kind of reminded me of Moby Dick a little bit, funny enough, because that's another classic book which you're supposed to read, and I slogged my way through it. And that book, it does have like a core story which is really interesting, but that's like at least half of that book is just him explaining the whaling industry. Like just going really, really into depth about these are the different types of whales and the shapes of their skulls and their bones, and this is how we catch them, and this is how we cook them, and then we sell them, and then we do. And it's like, am I reading a novel, or am I reading like a teach yourself how to hunt
Non-fiction.
whales book? Yeah. But again, very, very, very popular and successful book. So I guess audiences of the past were just more
maybe they wanted
minded.
to actually learn something, learn something non-fiction which they didn't know within a particular fictional novel context.
Yeah, something like
Possibly.
that. Yeah. Yeah, but nonetheless, I mean, a very satisfying book in the end, very iconic. I mean, the most shocking part for me, though, was when he just ditched all the Spanish. He just ditched them and just like, because because he rescues the Spanish guys, or the Spanish guy, and then he makes a deal with them to bring the others over to the island, and then they're going to build a ship together, and then they're going to escape. And then all of a sudden, this English boat turns up, and he just has a whole adventure to take control of this English boat. And as soon as he takes control, I'm thinking, oh, he'll go to the mainland and get the Spanish. But he just doesn't. He's just like, in a paragraph, it's like, yeah, and boom, he's back in England. Like, not even a second thought. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, I need to research the geopolitical alliances at the time because, you know, there might be an element of that here because there's the Portuguese captain who saves him, and he won't stop praising the Portuguese captain throughout the novel. Maybe rightly so, considering what he does. But with regards to the Spanish, there's one point where he's hesitant to when he meets the Spaniard compared to, let's say, when he meets other people. And also there's a moment where he criticizes Spanish colonization, saying that they were far too brutal and that the English way was better or something like that with regards to colonization.
Yeah. The the legend of the terrible conquistadors, which is kind of interesting, seeing as, I mean, they do have a reputation for being very, very cruel, but at the same time, they did kind of integrate themselves. Well, they did breed with the natives, put it that way. Whereas the colonizers in North America, they just flipping annihilated. I mean, America's built on a race war, essentially, just endless war with the locals and just wipe them all out. So it's kind of funny.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny that the Spanish have got such a bad reputation in comparison to the North Americans, who literally
sort of like survivorship bias. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, right.
So there's no survivors. There's no one to say how bad you were.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, the novel was written in 1719, so I don't know exactly when it was supposed to be. Oh, it's set in 1651 to 1687. Yeah, so this is like the great age of the buccaneer. This is like this is pirate age, essentially. Yeah, so I guess a lot of conflict with Spain at that time. Yeah, definitely. But nonetheless, so you were comparing it to the Odyssey?
Yeah, so in my mind, Odysseus was the first castaway. There's moments in the Odyssey where it's been a while since I read it, but he gets shipwrecked on the island of Calypso, and he gets shipwrecked on various other islands. Have you read the Odyssey?
Yeah, I've read that one. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the other thing is, this story is almost as fantastical as, you know, a mythological story in terms of the curious types of people he meets, and you know, the strange cannibals that can, you know, you can compare those to some of the tribes Odysseus meets in terms of how strange they seem, let's say, or how savage they are. And then there's also, you know, the wild beasts he meets. Almost, he, you know, there's still an element of mystery and uncertainty and apprehension with regards to those, which can be, even though it's a secular, non-religious, non-mythological, it's just as exotic and strange as the mythological creatures.
Yeah, there's something quite terrifying about the savages and the thought of being cannibalized by them. That's for sure. Something quite.
And his mood throughout his time on the island is interesting, how it changes. So the first time he arrives, he senses immediate danger, and he just spends days retrieving all the goods and all the items which could possibly be of any use to him for his survival from the ship before the tides change and then the ship's no longer accessible. And then he starts to gradually master the world around him, the island around him, and think himself as a king. But I suppose before that, there's the fever he has and the bad dreams, and also he makes a list of the good things and the bad things. about his time. I mean, about his situation. And I like the idea of making that good and bad list, because it gives you an opportunity to reflect in a bad scenario what you should be still grateful for, and that's a good way to cope, I think.
Yeah, he's constantly trying to remind himself that he should be grateful that he's alive, essentially, and to overlook the fact that he's just incredibly lonely, I suppose. I mean, that's really the thing that gets him in the end. I mean, he's in the beginning, like you say, like he's struggling to survive, he's struggling to hunt, he's struggling to build his little like house, his castle as he calls it. But then he learns how to tame the goats and grow various different plants and what have you, so he can survive. And then it's just the loneliness, essentially. He's all alone. I mean, I think it's quite a tragic story in a way, because
Well, it's tragic for most of it, and then it sort of resolves towards the end, I suppose. There's also 2 sequels to this. Did you know?
Yeah.
But no one reads them.
Yeah, I think the first sequel is like Further Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, and then the last one apparently is just a series of essays about the character. He's also got an island named after him, apparently, somewhere. They named an island after him. But yeah, he struggles. Yeah, he just struggles with his loneliness, basically. I think it is quite tragic, because he loses 24 years of his life. By the time he gets out there, by the time he gets back home, he's in his 40s, isn't he?
Yeah, but all he would be doing for those 24 years is his middle-class job, which his father wanted him to do, which he, with his adventurous spirit, might consider boring. And when he gets back, he's got all this money, and he settles down with a wife. So it's not too tragic an ending, considering most of a novel is tragic. It's a bit like when you have a symphony in minor and then you end on a major chord or something like that.
Yeah, it ends well. Yeah, all's well that ends well, I suppose. Does he get a wife in the end? I missed that bit. I don't know.
It's like one sentence.
Oh, right.
It very important compared to the rest.
Well, that was the thing I was going to say about the book. There's absolutely no mention of any kind of sexual craving at all.
It's not a love story at all.
Well, it's not only that. It's just he's alone on this island for all this time, and never does he mention the fact that he misses women. Just he talks about missing human company, but there's no kind of mention or no kind of idea of missing the company of a lady. Even when he's in Brazil with his estate, there's no mention of any kind of female companionship or anything. Which, if somebody was writing a book like this these days, they would say something about it, obviously. But I guess back in those days they had a lot more restraint.
Yeah, I suppose with his dissenter background, he probably would be less inclined to talk about something like that, or to consider it as important. And I suppose the religious aspect is more prominent in this compared to any kind of love interest or anything. I can't even think of any women in the novel other than the wife at the end and maybe the mother at the beginning.
Yeah, well, it was written in 1719. So, well, I guess, yeah, I mean, quite some time after the English Civil War. But nonetheless, I suppose I don't know too much about the dissenters. I mean, there were many, many different Protestant sects in England at that time, I suppose.
Yeah, it depends which type he is.
Yeah, I don't know too much about Daniel Defoe. I have to be honest with you.
I read a short, one of those really short biographies you get from encyclopedias. So I can talk about that for a bit if you want.
Yeah, go on then.
Yeah, so it's interesting because you know how the character Crusoe, at the very beginning, it says he changed his name. Well, Daniel Defoe, he changed his name because his surname used to be Foe. So you can see there's he's putting himself in the character a bit there. And he was actually in the Monmouths Rebellion, if you've heard of that. And he got nearly got in trouble. Well, that was some kind of rebellion against King James II. My history isn't. I'm not as erudite as some other people in our circles probably, but I'm working on it. Let's say. In fact, it's mainly because of the education system, so I'll just outsource my ignorance to that. And
No, I
then
won't worry about it, mate. No, you're doing fine.
yeah, so he was a spy for William III, so it was clearly on the side of the Glorious Revolution,
Right,
and he had lots of ups and downs in his life, and that's um, in all his novels are basically very similar to that idea of lots of ups and downs. And there's this quote from him: "No man has tasted differing fortunes more, and 13 times I have been rich and poor." And this is exemplified when he became imprisoned for £17,000 of debt, which is an insane amount of money for that time. And
right,
they somehow, this was something to do with insurance for French ships or something like that. And somehow he negotiated himself out of this impossible situation. I didn't read into how he did that, but that sounds quite interesting. However, he managed to escape the debtor's prison of the time.
right. Yeah, yeah. It sounds like he had an interesting life.
He was
Which is
also a
all.
pamphleteer, which is like I don't want to draw modern equivalents, but it's a bit like being a 4chan shit poster with the amount of random things he put out. It's like one of those things was the True Born Englishman, where he's justifying the fact that King William III is Dutch by saying that there's no that as long as he integrates, he's fine. So
He
there's a
says
lot
there's
that could
no
be
such
said
thing as
about that.
he says there's no such thing as a true-born Englishman. Is that what he says?
I'm not sure. I haven't read it. I'm just aware of this pamphlet's existence. But yes, it would be interesting to read because it was well known at the time, and it was used to justify, the ascension of William III.
Oh, so he was a multiculturalist, the bastard. Oh dear.
Yeah, but in a context, it was sort of a Northern European Protestant only
Yeah,
multiculturalist.
yeah,
So it's
fair enough.
not completely subversive, but you can see how it can easily be twisted to something subversive, or
I'm
how it can
I'm
be a precursor to that.
I'm basically on the side of the Glorious Revolution anyway. I think that was the right way to go. Otherwise, we'd all be Catholic now. And
Yes, I agree.
so I understand. I'm on
It
the
makes
side of the.
sense geopolitically, even though I'm not Christian at all. I'm pagan actually.
Oh
But
right, okay,
yeah. So there's the
yeah.
other
Well,
pamphlets.
I
Yeah,
think it's
go
something
on.
to be. I think it's something to be celebrated in our culture because we are a very, very rebellious culture, and we managed to break away from the church, and we managed to break away from Catholic tyranny, and we managed to break away from Rome and the papacy and all of that. And indeed, we managed in many ways. We kind of led the Reformation. I mean, of course, it was Martin Luther in Germany that got the ball rolling, but he was inspired by what was his name? Wycliffe's Bible, right? Wycliffe was the morning star of the Reformation, as they say. Him and his followers, and the Lollards, and what's his name? Something John Ball or something, took part in the Peasants' Revolution. So Wycliffe's Bible inspired John Huss, and John Huss inspired um, Martin Luther. In fact, Martin Luther said he was a Hussite at one point. So we did kind of kick off the Reformation in some ways. We did play
Contributed to it very
certainly
much.
certainly contributed it. Like so, we did like the beginning bit, and then the Germans did like the middle bit, and then we kind of like sustained it by continuing. Well, we defeated the Spanish Armada and so on and so forth. So we kind of smashed this European tyranny, and
The
we
biggest
are
negative about
sorry.
it, the biggest negative about it, from my perspective, is the cultural destruction from the abolition of the monasteries, all the manuscripts that were lost. But on the flip side of that, there's all the interesting things that were created by Protestants, such as the music of Bach, the poetry of John Milton, etc. So it's a sort of creative destruction in my mind. Creation and destruction go together.
Yeah, I think I just think Henry VIII didn't really have much of a choice, because those monks would always have sided with the papacy, and they were massively powerful, and they did own a lot of land. I mean, you got to understand, like, these people, like, was like 25% of the land in the country was just owned by the church. This was a huge, like, monolithically powerful institution. So it had to be destroyed. I think it's a shame. I think it's damaged the Protestant religion in the long term, because they don't have a tradition of celibacy. And because they don't have a tradition of celibacy, they don't really have, like, very, very, very serious religious people. Whereas the Catholic Church, despite its massive corruption, it does have the monasteries, and it does have a priesthood which is at least 50% celibate. And so you have a group of men who are really serious about the religion. They're really serious about it. And so they have a certain vibe about them, a certain mood about them, which gives the religion some depth. Whereas here in England, it was kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like we tore down the Catholic faith, and then we had this mad burst, like you say, of dissent. All these, like, we declared ourselves to be the New Jerusalem. We had the Levelers. We had the what was it called? The Fifth Monarchy Men. We had all these crazy people, like, just reading the Old Testament and getting hyper biblical, and it was interesting.
It's part of our history.
It's part of our history. Yeah, I don't think it should be denied. I mean, I think we should embrace our history, some total. But it has fizzled out in a way, because now we've got, I don't know if you saw in the news, but they got in Canterbury Cathedral, they're having a rave.
Oh, that's just.
Did you see that on Twitter? Did you see it?
Just decline of the West is all I can say.
Yeah. And the Catholic Church, no matter how corrupt they are, they wouldn't do that. They just wouldn't do it.
I need to download that and put that in my Kali Yuga folder full of all the degenerate things from modernity.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really bad. I mean, I remember getting very upset when I went to a cathedral, and they asked me to pay to go in. It's like, what are you talking about? I have to pay? I have to pay to enter into the house of God? Like, you just shouldn't do it. It's wrong. And the Catholic Church just wouldn't do that, as far as I understand it. You go to the cathedral, it's free, right? Because you go there to pray. But many of our ancient churches have just been turned into tourist venues by the Church of England. So
might be because of the Church of England, fewer attendance and everything. I don't know the reason.
Well, they're doing it for the money, and again, it's like a short-term benefit, but a long-term loss, because at the end of the day, you'll make a bit of money out of it, but you're gutting the religion. You're taking away the religious spirit, and so all you're left with is a bunch of old museums, essentially, that nobody takes seriously. So, yeah, they've killed it, 100%. But then again, on the other hand, I don't think America would look the way it looks if it wasn't for the Puritans and their well, they were just utterly racist. Essentially, they were just utterly racist against the savages, and they wouldn't breed with them.
Yeah, if they were less racist, there would be fewer black people in America today. Possibly.
Well, okay. I mean, yeah, that's a good comeback. But I'm just saying, like, I'm just saying they didn't breed with the North Americans. That was my point I was trying to make.
Yeah,
Whereas, the conquistadors, they did breed with
they
with the
created their own
locals.
sort of caste system, I suppose,
Yeah, which then
with
fell to
various
pieces.
levels of mestizo.
Yeah, mestizos and Creoles and God knows, I don't know. I've looked into it. It's very interesting. I mean, that's where the word caste system comes from, doesn't it? It comes
It's
from
a different approach to civilization.
where it fails ultimately. It's always
Yeah,
going to fail because there's always going to be some kind of revolution, and then the whole thing will get upturned, and
well, I
then
think all
that's it.
civilizations fail. It's just they fail in different ways.
Yeah. Well, it fails. It fails to
Oh, and
protect.
some just completely get absorbed into another. Like, obviously, with this example, the Aztecs, they had a civilization, they had a way of life, and then smallpox happened.
Yeah. Yeah. But I'm just making the point. The caste system, just in the long term, it's never going to protect the racial purity of a nation because you're only one revolution away. You're only one civil disturbance away from that being turned on its head. You know what I mean? Um, Kind of like the Egyptians, right? The Egyptians were white; they had black slaves, and then at some point, doof, it's gone, right? So kind of
Yeah,
like the Indians. I mean, they were white, and then Buddhism came along, destroyed the caste system, created this egalitarian system, and then there's a lot of interbreeding, and then that's it. It's the end. So I mean, the only real defense is an ethno state, essentially. That's
yeah,
what I'm trying to
sort of
say.
monoethnic class system
Yeah,
with various degrees of feudalism, I suppose. That's the
yeah,
European approach, or indeed the only approach when you live in a monoethnic society, as we have for hundreds of years, where it would be difficult for someone who has evolved in, a continent completely different side of the earth to live and to have multiple generations in a scenario where there's no central heating or anything. So nature was on our side back then, but today the elements are easier to overcome.
yeah. Nobody wanted to go north. Nobody wanted that. People were like, nah, nah, mate, you can keep it. You keep your snowy civilization up there in the ice. Um, but now they do. Yeah, and
Because there's a
that's it.
welfare state.
Because there's a welfare state. Yeah, yeah. There you go. It's Kali Yuga. I wonder what Robinson Crusoe would think about it. So, what do we think? What do you think about his relationship with Friday? Then it's quite interesting, is it? That he's got absolutely no um, qualms at all about slavery. No
Yeah,
problem.
he was enslaved himself for 2 years by a Turk, and he
Yeah,
has the concept of universal morality of slavery being some kind of abomination would just be ridiculous at the time, because considering slavery had existed since time immemorial up to that point, and it wasn't until 100 or 200 years later you'd get the William Wilberforce types and the abolitionists. So it makes sense to a modern reader. It might not make sense how he can be enslaved for 2 years and then immediately set up his own slave plantation and see no contradiction. But at that time, it makes complete sense. There's no you just find freedom for yourself whenever you can obtain it. You
yeah.
don't care about the universalism.
Well, he never said that slavery was bad. He was just upset that he was enslaved, essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it was just a thing that was just taken for granted, I suppose. It was just like, well, this is the way these people are, or this is something bad that happens in the world, and that's it. And there you go.
Yeah.
Um,
There are
so
many
that
different types of slavery. Some are more paternalistic, and then others are more brutal, and some are like a sort of caste system again, like the Greeks and the Helots, the Spartans and the Helots, rather. In
right,
this, his relationship with Friday, I would say, is well, it's not even slavery; it's more like a servant, I suppose. But the slaves on the plantation, he has no relationship with those. But it's interesting his relationship with Friday, because Friday pledges himself to be his servant. He actually places Crusoe's foot on it, on Friday's head.
Yeah. He does. Yeah,
Just
he
taken as some
submits.
kind of symbol. And his first order is to decapitate another savage, which is quite
Yeah,
gruesome.
yeah, and then he orders him not to, cannibalize anybody. You're not allowed to eat the body, and so on and so forth. But it is, yeah, it's just he's definitely very. I don't know. There's definitely like a friendship there with Friday. Um, some kind of friendship, but it's not. Well, not really. It's his servant, isn't it? But he's definitely like very very grateful to have somebody to talk to because he's been lonely for such a long time, and it's like finally he's got someone to talk to. But it's also quite clearly defined that he's the master and that's the servant. So yeah, it is very interesting. And then when they finally leave, Friday doesn't get mentioned at all, right? Throughout, they do this whole thing where they have the fight with the mutineers and they take the ship back, and then they get in the boat, and then all of a sudden they're back in England. And I'm reading 2-3 pages, and there's no mention of like how Friday is adapting to his new world, right? How Friday is coping with England or anything like that. There's just no mention of it at all until you get to
Just
that
goes
scene.
straight from decapitating, eating people to just living in some middle class suburb in London or something. It's quite
Yeah,
absurd. But no, there is that story where he fights the bear after they
the
fight
bear.
the
Yeah.
wolves. Um, that part was just weird. It just sounded like animal abuse to me for some reason.
Um. Well, that's another part of the story because that when he escapes from the Turks, he does kill a lion, doesn't he? Very very casually, just for sport, just for game, essentially. I mean, they do take the coat at the end, they skin it, but still, it's just like, oh look, there's a lion, I can kill it with my gun, and then boom, it just goes and does it. So they,
Yeah, it is a primal instinct, I suppose, but it's also an instinct which has led to, species going extinct and everything. Some people would argue that now we care a lot more about animals and there's less chance of extinction than before when we were more primitive and we didn't really care that much and it was more in our nature to hunt for the enemy, the animal, and that's so fundamental. And hunting is very important in this novel, I think. Um, on one level, he's both there are several different types of hunting. There's the hunter-gatherer and his
right.
approach to hunting, and there's also the aristocratic approach to hunting, and he takes on both of these roles at the same time. He's sort of completely civilized and completely a barbarian at the same time, which I think is fascinating.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, there is. They have a totally different relationship with the animals. It's very interesting. I mean, we see it with the wolves, don't we? Like even in the middle of Europe, um, the threat of nature is still there. They get surrounded by 300 wolves, I think, and they manage to fight them off.
Yeah, the
So
description of a battle with the wolves is like some kind of full-on military engagement of various waves of infantry. It's quite an interesting description there.
it's quite terrifying, really. But I guess that's why, yeah, as you say, back in that they just had a different attitude to killing, I guess. And I think I don't know if perhaps we don't have that instinct anymore these days. Perhaps partly it is because we've been emasculated. I think partly it is just it's just natural for us because we know that these animals are going extinct essentially, and so we
I
just
think there's competing instincts within us from hunting animals to being cooperative with them and breeding them agriculturally speaking, raising livestock, which involves care for them, and those two vie with the other to some degree.
well, there's that, but you can't domesticate a lion, and yet we still want to protect them. and that we still know that these are dangerous animals that will kill us.
It's like
And
William Blake's poem, "Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night." We still have a certain appreciation for their beauty, even though they're a completely savage, ferocious beast which would tear your face off. We still want them to exist.
Yeah, you still got people complaining about polar bears dying, apparently, allegedly, because of global warming or whatever. And it's like, well, I don't know. If you ever met a polar bear, that'd be the end of you, because they don't give up. They just run at you and they kill you, and that's it. Job done. So yeah, I guess it's just we know the environment has changed. We know animals are going extinct these days, and we're more careful about it, I guess. So there you go. I do feel like Robinson Crusoe is I think he's a very brave character. That's for sure. Like he does talk about being afraid, especially when he sees, like when he first arrives on the island, and also when he's in the storm, and also when he sees the footprint. So he does talk about being very, very terrified. But when it comes to fight, he's like, I mean, when he sees those natives, those savages cannibalizing those people, he's patrolling around the place with 2-3 guns, in his pocket and his sword. He's ready to take on like 100 of them. It's very interesting, like this European attitude of, oh, this stupid savage in the jungle. I'll just barge in there and slaughter the lot of them.
Yeah, he morally questions it first, though. He says, well, these are cannibals, but maybe it's just their culture. Maybe they just have a right to be cannibal savages, and I should just leave them alone. Maybe that is the point. But once he learns that they have white men with them, well, first of all, there's some kind of subconscious ethnic alliance potentially with the white people that are there. And second of all, if there are white people, that means that maybe there's some chance of civilization or a ship or something or some way of getting back. So that's the sort of motivation I think he has there for attacking these savages.
Yeah, that, and just like rescue the bros. It's one of his guys. It's a European, definitely. But he's not a coward. I mean, he talks about being afraid, but when it comes to a fight, he'll do it. And the other thing that impresses me is he just has this very he just has this attitude of being an English lord, essentially. Like, this is my island, right? And now you're on my island, and and I'm in charge here, and this is what we're going to do, right? He just
exactly. He just claims the island.
Yeah, he claims it. It's like, yeah.
Once he's become completely accustomed to it, and he considers himself the lord, and he's got his country home, which is a tent, and then some summer house near the coast, which is just another tent or some kind of makeshift shack.
Yeah.
He really starts to embrace and fantasize about it until he finds the footprint, and then his attitude changes, and he becomes completely apprehensive and full of anxiety, and until he discovers this part of the island which for some reason he's never been to before, and he sees all the cannibalized corpses and limbs strewn across the beach or something like that. And this just flips something in his head. And then I suppose with a footprint, there's it's quite a clever concoction in the writing, because it's just such a small thing which completely flips everything, because he thought he was alone on this island completely, and now he's just questioning everything. But when he finds, yes, there are savage cannibals who want to eat you, he almost finds some kind of catharsis in that, because at least now he's certain of what there is, even though it's the worst possible thing.
Yeah, I guess it's like the terror of
the unknown.
Like you think you're comfortable, and then you realize actually you've been really close to death. Like, you've just been completely ignorant of it. This whole time there's been this bunch of savages on your island paradise, and you just didn't even notice it. And so I guess, you get the fear of contacting these people, but you also get I don't know, like a sense of violation or a sense of like that was a close encounter, you know, or you get a sense of like, oh, how lucky I was not to have stumbled onto these people before. So yeah, it's definitely a good one. I guess it's like a home invasion, you know, like you're in your home, you're walking around your house, and all of a sudden you notice that door's open, and you knew that door was closed, and you're like, hang on a minute, I know the back door was closed and now it's open, or something like that. You know what I mean? You get this like sense of dread. So yeah, very effective piece of writing. Very
it's interesting how his he becomes sort of addicted to dread and danger to some degree, because otherwise he wouldn't keep going on these expeditions. And you know, he's completely terrified, but when the opportunity comes for should I go further into the danger, he always does for some reason. And he considers that, even though he later, to bring in the religious aspect, he even uses the word original sin to describe his attitude towards disobeying his father's advice and going on this mad adventure. And yeah, you can compare it to Paradise Lost a little bit, because it depends on whether you consider it is, if it's a prison he's on, or if it's something redemptive, or what. He's a prisoner, but at the same time he has absolute freedom. It's very bizarre. It's full of these contradictions.
Oh, right. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, he is. Yeah, he's a prisoner on the island, but he can go anywhere and do anything he wants. And he's also relatively wealthy. I mean, he's got enough food to eat.
Although the gold means nothing to him when he discovers the gold.
Right.
Because there's various, I think economists like this novel, and it's used in economic thought to describe you know, when there's an economy with just one person, and then you add another person Friday, and then you describe the exchange of goods between them. It's also, in a way, a sort of libertarian novel, if that's not too much of a stretch.
No, I think it definitely is. It definitely, because it's a survivalist.
There's no nanny state telling him you can't do that. And there's no large corporation. Well, there are large corporations at the time, but there's nothing in his way obstructing him from doing what he likes. And he enjoys his guns. And I enjoy reading about the proud description he has of his appearance, with his goatskin cap and his goatskin outfit and his 2 muskets and his 2 pistols and his sword and his umbrella and his animals.
Yeah,
it's all very free-spirited, I think, but in a good way, not in a modern degenerate way.
Yeah, I wonder if it was an inspiration for, what's that novel called? Is it Walden? I think, is it called, by Thoreau? You know that. Anyway, the American author, and he wrote a book about, you know, living in a cabin in the woods. American transcendentalist. But yeah, it's definitely, it's this. Yeah, it's like, I'm going to go and live in the forest by myself. It's that vibe. I am a survivalist, and that's kind of what America was. That's what made America great. America is the original survivalist nation. It's back to nature. It's you against nature. Instead of you against man. It's freedom. That's essentially what it is. Man in the wilderness is a freedom. So yeah, it's a lonely freedom, but it is a freedom. So you're right. It's kind of paradoxical, isn't it? He's in a prison, but he's free at the same time. He also just creates a lot of wealth for himself. He seems to be very lucky in that regard. You know, he gets turned into a slave, and then he manages to escape, and then he gets this big farm in Brazil, and then he quits that, and then he gets in this island, and then he creates all this wealth on this island, and he lands on his feet again and again. He is in many ways, I suppose, like a master of his world.
Yeah, the author didn't have a happy ending. He died in poverty, although at quite a late age. He lived a long time, but he did die in poverty, hiding from the people he owed money to, his creditors.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so that's clearly an inspiration here. And maybe one of the reasons that Defoe wrote so many books, it said he wrote maybe over 500 books, or I don't know if book is being used how the
Well, they
extent
say
to
this.
which what
They
a book
say
is.
this is the first English novel, don't they?
Well, I don't think that's true. Pilgrim's Progress is earlier, isn't it? And then there
Yeah,
was
that's
another one
correct.
I found. I can't even remember the name of it, but there was another one which is even earlier, and I never saw that in any description. It mainly depends on what your definition of a novel is. I mean,
Right.
someone was saying, oh, there was this Japanese woman in about 1000 AD who wrote the first novel or something, but I can think of an ancient Greek, ancient Roman novel actually. What is it called? Daphnis and Chloe or something like that. I need to
Right.
read that one. That was in about, I don't know, 200 AD, 300 AD.
Right. Yeah, it's just one of those. Yeah, I think you're right. Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress is probably be the first, wouldn't it? That was a slog. My God, getting through that. Yeah. Um, what an interesting. Yeah, but yes, yeah, he wrote a lot of books. And he died in poverty. Poor bastard. Poor bastard. There's no money in writing, and now his book is so famous. But there
Well,
you
his
go.
book
That's
was famous at the time. That's the thing. It's just he was so much in debt. And
right.
he tried to get to the same level of success as he did with Robinson Crusoe, with his, two sequels, and with various other books like Captain Singleton, which follows a similar pattern. But he just never achieved the same success as this novel in particular, I think.
Mm. Yeah, and then he ended up dying in poverty.
It's interesting if you want to talk about how he influenced other writers like Jonathan Swift. Um,
Oh,
Gulliver's
you were saying,
Travels.
yeah, you were saying this. Gulliver's Travels was inspired by him, or something like that.
Yeah, I think it might slightly be a satire of this, but also a satire of other travel novels which were popular at the time, whatever they were. And also here, the pamphlets Defoe wrote, one of them was satirical. And I don't know if this was an inspiration for Swift's later A Modest Proposal, but this shortest way with dissenters really put him in trouble. It was one of the main things in his life which sent him. I think he was pilloried or something and sent to prison. Quite an extreme circumstance, just like the characters of his novels. And Shortest Way of Dissenters is a satire. It's difficult to explain because it's like two levels of irony or something. But he's writing it from an anti-dissenter perspective, trying to present them as being, Fed posting, for lack of a better term, Fed posting of the time. And
Right.
so he got in trouble for that because it's for libel. So
Right.
that's and another pamphlet which I thought was interesting because it was quite radical was his pamphlet called Conjugal Lewdness, where he talks
Oh,
about
right.
how not allowed to have contraception because that's turning. This is what he says. He says that's turning your wife into a whore, apparently, and also it's infanticide. So that was maybe even extreme at the time. I don't know, or maybe it wouldn't be extreme. It's
No,
definitely extreme in a modern context.
I'm on his side. Yeah,
Mm.
contraception. I mean, even if you went back into the 50s, contraception was considered to be quite a dirty thing. Essentially, it's not something that you talked about openly.
Mm.
Um, because as you say, sex is supposed to be for the creation of children. That's what it's supposed to be for. I mean, yeah, you enjoy it. Everybody knows that you enjoy it, but it's supposed to be for children. And if you're not doing it for kids, then you're just you're just being dirty, essentially. So yeah, contraception, bad, bad. This is how degenerate we've become, by the way. I mean, this is just
Yeah, it's the main contributor to why there's a fertility crisis, I suppose. Other people in Nigeria don't care that much about contraception, or if they do, they don't use it very effectively, and it benefits them in terms of their fecundity, whereas we like to use it for some reason.
Yeah.
It's not done us any favors in terms of fertility, that's for sure. But then there's the argument of dysgenics and whether, what will you do if you were a government? Would you ban something? Would you ban it for a particular type of people? And what impact would this have? Would it have a eugenic or a dysgenic impact if, the lower classes start breeding more, but the upper classes start breeding less once you change contraception laws? So it's
well, ideally, you get all the foreigners out before you change the contraception laws. That'd be a thing.
Get your priorities.
Because you don't want them breeding anymore. So get them out and then just ban the pill. I would probably, despite the fact I am essentially a libertarian, I would probably ban the pill as a public health problem.
Definitely, because that has impacts on mood or impacts on the chemicals, maybe even a spiritual impact, which is negative, I think.
Yeah, it's a very, very destructive drug. I mean, as you say, it's impacted fertility, number one. People aren't having kids, so that impacts marriage. It creates a sexually loose society, but then on top of that, it physically damages the woman. It damages her ability to have children, and then on top of that, it affects her mood swings, and then on top of that, it enters into the water supply and it turns the frogs gay, right? And we've got a whole generation of younger men now who are just, I don't know, man. They're just very, very low T, very, very low testosterone. Younger generation men.
I know. It's got to have something to do with the environment.
It's in the water supply.
It could be genetic. It could be because, Edward Dutton would say something like, there's a change in who's breeding. Before only a small part of a population would breed. Now everyone breeds, which leads to mutation. More mutation means more people with differing genetic codes and therefore different levels of testosterone. But there's so many different theories as to why there's lower testosterone today. I'm not even sure which one is the correct one. I think it could just be a synthesis of various things. It could even be because we've abandoned spirituality. All we know is it's definitely bad and it needs addressing as soon as possible before we wipe ourselves out of existence.
Yeah, it's plummeting. I mean, we've all seen that study with they tested those guys in their 20s and they had testosterone levels which were comparable to men in their 60s, right? It's incredible. And these are young, and this is why our country is just being wiped out by foreigners. It's because young men these days are just they don't have any balls, they don't have any oomph, they're just not very aggressive, essentially. I can't imagine the government getting away with doing a lockdown in the 90s. I don't even 10 years ago, I don't think they would have got away with it. But now, it's a combination of things. It's the water supply, it's too much pornography, not enough exercise. It's just the psychology as well. I think men are just totally beaten down. All kinds of factors are affecting it, definitely. But I mean, if you put them on an island, maybe they'd find themselves. I don't know. Yeah, just take an average
solution.
Yeah, we just need like 1 million islands, and we just take every young English boy and just chuck them there and leave them, pick them up. 10 years time.
Maybe that'd be, you wouldn't get many survivors. I don't
No,
know.
you'd get like 10% survival rate or something like that. That'd be fine. That'd be okay. Yeah.
Yeah, this is one of my ideas of what's the difference between what's right wing and what's too left wing. What's if there is a way you can be too right wing, maybe it's you put so much eugenic pressure on someone that no one in society survives. But that's rarely ever the case. Normally, societies decline for being too left wing. But maybe I'm going on a tangent here.
No, I don't know. I think that's a fair point. I mean, you know, in regard to what Dutton said, I'm not entirely sure. I think he's definitely got a point. Like if you look at Thomas Malthus and what he said in Principles of Population, he kind of basically makes the point that if you're wealthy, you can marry young, and if you're not wealthy, you have to marry late. So, back in those days, before the 18th century, and kind of before that, essentially, like aristocratic women, they could get married at 16 or whatever. Marie Antoinette was married at 14. So they could get married at a very young age and they could have lots of children, and that was fine and that was normal. But your average peasant girl couldn't do that because they didn't have the money. And so Dutton is probably right to say that in the past, people on the upper echelons of society they were making more children than people on the lower echelons.
Yeah, we're all descended from the upper class. If you go back far enough, in theory. I think this
Right.
is like I can't remember the name of the book, but it's another scientific novel, probably by one of Dutton's colleagues, about the sun also rises, and it details how class changes. I'm getting them mixed up because I actually need to read these books one day. But yeah, we're all descended from the upper class in theory, because the lower class would have less children, and then it accumulates over time the amount of upper class ancestors you have.
Well, yeah, it's like you fall into poverty and now you're in the meat grinder, right? That's it. You got no money. You are a genetic dead end, essentially. It's kind of sad, isn't it? But it's kind of true. Which makes it that's a very interesting point you make there, actually, because it does make you wonder in your head, like the rich families that they're the ones that manage to stay in the top.
Yeah.
It's not so much that they climb to the top. It's more like, no, they managed to stay there because they managed to keep their money. If you can just keep your money and not waste it, not blow it out the window. Yeah.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is it's also based on hereditary. So it's money is one thing, but it's also based on what ancestors you have. And if your ancestors are descended, the higher level descended ancestors you have. So that makes it more confusing.
What do you mean high level? What do you mean?
Well, if you think about one of William Hogarth's paintings or series of paintings, Marriage a la Mode, there's this sort of transaction between this very rich middle class family and a very poor upper class family. And the son of one family marries a daughter from another family. So they both, in theory, would get a lot of wealth and a lot of social prestige in terms of their ancestry being upper class. Having inherited titles, that's the sort of thing I'm talking about here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You got to marry well, and then you can keep the wealth together. As long as you don't marry your cousin, in which case you'll end up looking like a Habsburg or something.
You have to aim at the third cousin. Apparently, that's the optimum, according to.
Is it?
The cousin's cousin's cousin, and there's no inbreeding associated with that at all. And that's as close ethnocentrically you can possibly get to yourself without being inbred.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's kind of weird. That's kind of interesting.
But if you think about it, we do have the same ancestors as people we fall in love with often, but their ancestors going back 5, 6, 7 generations. So there's no inbreeding associated there.
Really?
Because it wouldn't make sense otherwise. It wouldn't make sense otherwise because you can't have 2 and then double that number over and over again and have that be your ancestry. Because then that would get to an exponential level of people. It's difficult to explain.
So people are attracted to people they're distantly related to?
Well, of course.
I never thought about that before.
That's what a race is. It's just a very extended family.
Well, yeah. I mean, you're attracted to your own race, sure, but your 7th cousin, I don't know. I mean, because my family line doesn't go back enough, so it just makes you wonder, doesn't it? It just makes you wonder. I wonder who's out there. Wonder what my 7th cousin is doing right now.
Probably don't want to know.
Probably don't want to know. They're probably on Tinder, probably on OnlyFans or something like that. Right. Anyway, on that note, that was an hour, and I don't really want to go for more than an hour. So thank you very much for coming on the show, Frederick Tarr. That was a very entertaining conversation about Robinson Crusoe.
That's fine. I enjoyed it.
There you go.
I'm happy to do another one if you'd like to.
Yeah, we can do another book. Yeah, we'll have a chat about that. I'm currently slogging my way through Spengler, which I'm regretting, but my God, yeah. Not enjoying that at all.
Decline of the West.
Yeah. Well, it is a famous one, and everybody on the Dissident Right talks about it, so I've got to read it at some point. But it's just like some kind of weird esoteric historical poetry or something. I mean, I'm not even sure what it is, but anyway. So that's 1,000 pages long, so that'll keep me busy for a while. But yeah, we'll definitely do another book at some point. And that's it. There you go. All right. Thank you very much. All right. Right. See you later then. All right. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.